Hello and welcome to this CME program entitled Hematologic Malignancies and Clinical Trial Participation, a Shared Decision-Making Approach. My name is John Kuruvilla. I'm a hematologist and investigator working at the Princess Margaret Cancer Centre in Toronto, Canada. Here are my disclosures. And this program has been supported by an independent medical education grant from Merck. So to begin with, let's discuss the definition of what a clinical trial can be. As I think many of you know, the definition I've highlighted here is that a clinical trial is a research investigation involving humans to prevent, detect, treat, or understand disease processes or medical conditions. When we think about clinical trials, they come in many different shapes and sizes, and these include both non-interventional as well as interventional trials, though certainly in oncology, we tend to focus more on interventional studies. When thinking about non-interventional clinical trials, these may focus on questions such as prevention, trying to understand and prevent the development of a disease, can look at screening where we try to detect a condition early. This can look at diagnostic pathways, can potentially study the natural history of a disease. And certainly from an observational standpoint, we can just better understand what happens to a participant over time. As I highlighted earlier, from an interventional perspective, we tend to think about trials in oncology as being a key for us to develop better therapies for patients. These, again, come in different phases, phase 1 and 2 and 3 clinical trials. And these may be open label or they may be blinded depending on the design and what an investigator or sponsor may be trying to accomplish. Let's drill into this in a little more detail by looking at the specific phases and some of these definitions a little bit further. So when we think about a phase 1 clinical trial, this looks at typically a small group of patients, and we're trying to understand the safety of an agent and evaluate to try to determine the appropriate dose of that drug that's typically being studied. The problem here is these may be the first time in a human that a clinical trial evaluates a drug. It might be the first time in a disease. Again, it might be a combination approach that's being tested for the first time, though we may understand both drugs. So certainly the cons seem obvious. You don't understand the potential for side effects. And if these are drugs that have never been evaluated before, you also may not understand the potential benefit. Though, again, if these are drugs that do have some experience behind them, you may be expecting some degree of effectiveness. On a pro, this allows us to get patients involved early in research. And for some patients in cancer, as we know, when you get beyond standard therapies, we are in need of innovative approaches. And so this gives an opportunity for patients to still access novel therapies. Typically, many of the studies that we do in oncology or in hematology are in the phase 2 setting. And these tend to look at a discrete group of patients, typically a larger number of patients, where we're looking at a specific dose to better understand the effectiveness of a treatment. At the same time, in that bigger patient population, you'll be better able to understand safety discretely in this group of patients. And depending on the design, these trials may be randomized, and they could include a control arm. They could include a placebo group as well. But again, when you look at the goal here, really the pro of this is a drug that you understand some preliminary safety. You have some preliminary idea of efficacy, and you're trying to better define this in a more discrete and homogeneous subset of patients. That being said, these are still drugs that come with some risks. You're better trying to understand safety. You're better trying to understand efficacy. And again, depending on the study, if this involves randomization, this may incorporate a placebo. This may be a control arm, as an example, that is standard therapy. And the experimental arm in a randomized design might be also testing a novel agent in combination with standard treatment, as an example. Ultimately, if phase 1 and phase 2 testing are successful, the goal is to bring a new therapy into the phase 3 setting. And so these are often registrational studies where we're trying to really define efficacy in comparison to a gold standard. and also better assess safety, again, in a large number of patients to, again, benchmark it against a standard of care. And in the end, if these results look favorable, if a trial meets its primary endpoint, this could be used by regulators as well as payers around the world to lead to the approval of an agent. This is the highest level of evidence that we generally have in the setting of clinical trials. Certainly, these can be very labor intensive. They may run for a number of years. They may be very expensive. You run the risk of negative clinical trials in the phase 3 setting as well. But this is the ultimate goal, and this is the best way to ultimately move a treatment into the standard of care. In many settings, the preference may be to use double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials so that you can isolate any of the potential biases of interpreting a study, whether it's a patient or the clinicians looking after that patient in terms of the biases that could go into interpreting side effects, et cetera. But this may not always be the case in the oncology or hematology space. Couple of other definitions here just to highlight the open label studies. So patients and the clinicians looking after them are usually aware of the treatment that's being given. This is often the case where a placebo may not be practical or where it may not be necessary or even feasible. In the absence of a placebo, as I highlighted earlier, this does increase the potential for bias. Lastly, studies may have an extension phase in which if a treatment has been deemed to be effective, there may be the opportunity to enroll further patients onto a study so that they may derive the benefit of the treatment when it's been well established. And as an example, we may be waiting for regulatory approval or funding to come forward. So certainly this may be an opportunity that's of significant benefit to patients because you get the opportunity to access treatment, but it does create a new commitment for a patient having to enroll in a clinical trial, to go to a clinical trial center, where in some cases, again, if the drug were to be approved and funded more rapidly, it may be easier accessed closer to home at their local center. With that as an introduction to the design and types of clinical trials, it's also important to highlight some endpoints that we use in these studies. Certainly, the most important endpoint that we think about in oncology is overall survival, and really looking at how many patients are alive after receiving the study intervention. A commonly used endpoint for clinical trials, and certainly often for registrational studies, is what we call progression-free survival, or PFS, which is time from randomization to progression or death. And so that is an endpoint that includes two highly important things, with progression being progression of cancer, which obviously would be important in understanding the effectiveness of a drug. Beyond that, event-free survival tends to take into account overall survival, typically includes disease progression as well, but would also highlight other important events that are relevant in the study of the cancer in that setting. And that could be lack of response, as an example. It could be a key toxicity event that might lead to discontinuation of treatment. And so this is a composite endpoint that we often use when thinking about the important events that also must be thought about beyond overall survival and disease progression. An event that's typically described when looking at an endpoint for phase 2 studies is a response endpoint. And this could be either overall response, OR, or complete response, CR, which reflects, again, the best degree of response you can see on imaging. Again, this is typically measured using an imaging test, whether that's a CT or a PET scan or both, and is typically something that can be reproduced and can be looked at centrally as well as at the local site where the patient was being treated. Toxicity measures are obviously important, looking at adverse events and any specific events that are going to be relevant to the therapy being evaluated. And another key measure of patient benefit here is to look at quality of life. Again, this may typically be assessed using questionnaires, and from a patient perspective, helps us better understand the impact of a treatment, perhaps the worsening of side effects in a very intensive therapy, but also the benefit in terms of providing disease control and improvement of cancer-related symptoms, as an example. So here's a summary slide looking at how active we are in the field of clinical research, and this is looking specifically at hematologic malignancy trials that are recruiting both in the US and worldwide. And this was referenced by looking at clinicaltrials.org. And you can see for common diseases, and you can look at diffuse large B-cell lymphoma there as an example, the most common lymphoma we see. It's 155 trials currently recruiting in the United States and almost 300 worldwide. When you look at acute myeloid leukemia, which remains an incredibly difficult to treat disease, over 300 studies in the US and almost 650 trials are recruiting worldwide. So you can certainly see the spectrum there. And where diseases where we've had major improvements in the past 20 years, such as multiple myeloma, again, almost between 550 to 600 clinical trials running worldwide. This really shows the benefit of running clinical trials in order to improve the outcomes for patients in a very timely manner. In the next section of this presentation, we're going to look at how clinical trials have led to improved treatments for hematologic malignancies. And I'd like to highlight this study because though it is over 20 years old, it represents one of the biggest steps forward in the field of lymphoma management. This is the original study that looked at the addition of rituximab to combination chemotherapy with CHOP as the first treatment for patients over the age of 60 with diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. This is a study run in France by the French Cooperative Group. And as you can see highlighted here, the 2-year progression-free survival showed a major benefit there, 13%. When you look at overall survival in this trial as well, it also was shown to be significantly improved as well. And when you see this type of a difference between the standard and experimental arm, this is a treatment that was very rapidly moved into the standard of care setting. In contrast, looking at polatuzumab, so this is a more modern study that was published 2 years ago, looking at the addition of an antibody drug conjugate targeting CD79B in combination, building on the R-CHOP backbone in diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. And you can see here the magnitude of benefit in this patient population is smaller, as you can see, at under 7%. And the 2-year progression-free survival, so this was the primary endpoint of the trial, was positive, but there was no overall survival advantage. And though this treatment has been approved in several countries, it hasn't been universally approved because you wonder about the magnitude of the benefit, particularly in relation to thinking a bit about the cost of the drug and the cost in relationship to that PFS benefit measured at 6.5%. And so this is some of the challenge moving forward when we've had prior success and outcomes have improved compared to historical data. The bar is much higher for novel therapies trying to get into the field today. Looking at a different example here, this is a single-arm phase 2 study looking at a different antibody drug conjugate. So this is brentuximab vedotin targeting CD30 in classical Hodgkin's lymphoma. And this is the pivotal trial that led to the initial approval of this study. So it was a single-arm study where the primary endpoint was overall response rate. The overall response rate was excellent at about 70%. When you look at the time to event analysis here, looking at progression-free survival, it's a little more modest, as you can see, at just under 6 months. But this was, again, a major step forward in Hodgkin's lymphoma. So this was a difficult to treat patient population where there were little in the way of targeted therapies available prior to this drug. And so this led to, rapid approval. And this is a drug that has now been incorporated successfully into the curative setting and even into the frontline therapy of stage 3 or 4 Hodgkin's lymphoma. Now, also looking at a different example, so this is lenalidomide. So this is, again, a cereblon binding agent that has multiple immunomodulatory effects. And this is looking at a study looking at lenalidomide given in combination with rituximab in a randomized study versus single agent rituximab. So from a design standpoint, multiple trials that looked at lenalidomide in lymphoma and in follicular lymphoma. We understood single agent activity. This was a randomized trial where the control arm was single agent rituximab, which had been approved in the mid to late 90s for follicular lymphoma, and the combination here showing an improvement in progression-free survival that was statistically significant, leading to the adoption of this regimen, again, in many jurisdictions around the world based on this phase 3 randomized controlled trial. One of the last examples I'll touch on here is ibrutinib looking at CLL. And again, ibrutinib is a BTK inhibitor that had very impressive activity as a single agent in a phase 1 study, which was responsible for leading to an accelerated approval based on very impressive data in highly refractory patients. The confirmatory phase 3 trial compared ibrutinib, a tablet, against ofatumumab, an intravenous anti-CD20 antibody, which had been previously approved for the treatment of CLL. And what you can see here is a major benefit in terms of progression-free survival. There was also an overall survival advantage in this clinical trial. And ibrutinib was a drug that went on to be developed further in multiple histologies. And then based on favorable results in marginal zone lymphoma in a single-arm phase 2 trial, initially approved there, additional data with Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia, where again, there's a genetic rationale behind the use of the drug in this setting. Again, so the combination with rituximab compared against rituximab monotherapy showing significant benefit. And again, these are the types of trials that have led to the approval of this and other BTK inhibitors in multiple indications over the past few years. So with that in mind, when you think about the world of clinical trials and thinking about how we as clinicians will interact with our patients, what are some of the common misconceptions that you hear about patients when thinking about clinical trial participation? So we can pause there and think about this for a few seconds. But, certainly some of the challenges here is when you look at a field that is really developed and seen major improvement in outcomes for patients when thinking about the results of clinical trials, presumably the most important thing to think about here is that many patients think that participating in a clinical trial will only lead to benefit, or the other extreme here is that patients won't want to go into studies because they don't want to be experimented on or treated as guinea pigs, which again seems to be a common phrase that comes up. When thinking about participating in studies, what do patients tend to highlight on, or what is important to think about? So there's certainly some potential benefits. In the conduct of clinical trials, you're frequently monitored quite closely. You may have more follow-up with blood testing and imaging. There's usually a clinical research team on top of the regular clinical team that will be managing a patient. And so that close follow-up is often viewed favorably by patients as they experience their treatment journey. There's certainly the perception of being able to contribute to medical research that will benefit other patients, if not themselves. And so, paying it back in a way, and again, recognizing that some of the treatments they might have received previously have come from the byproduct of other patients participating in research certainly can resonate to many. Clinical trials can be an access to novel therapies before they're widely available. And so there may be an obvious advantage with a treatment that already is somewhat studied or known. And there may be also the opportunity to connect with others that are living through this experience by participating in studies and being seen potentially in bigger centers. Some of the uncertainties or some of the cons about participating in research is again, the unknowns here. And again, how effective is a treatment going to be? What are the potential of side effects that may be not well described? Again, if a trial is blinded or placebo controlled, do you know you're getting an active therapy or the more effective therapy? These are big concerns to patients when again, you're already dealing in a complicated environment, often with a refractory cancer, dealing with cancer therapy for the first time. There may be more procedures involved, whether that's more blood testing or biopsies or more imaging, and that can often be a concern for patients. There may be logistics around more visits, and that can lead to some constraints around time and travel. And certainly all of this can contribute to more financial strains for patients and families in the event that some of these things may not be covered by the trial or the trial center. Certainly, there are other issues that come up when thinking about the participation of subjects in clinical trials. We know that minority groups tend to be underrepresented in clinical trials, and so this remains an important area of interest when we think about the generalizability of clinical trials. The example, there's certainly many to think of in our field, but when you look at African Americans in multiple myeloma, they do have an increased incidence of the disease than Caucasians, but only account for a fraction of the patients enrolled in clinical trials. And you do wonder if toxicities may be different, could efficacy be different? Important to understand. And the FDA and certainly other regulators in the world are very interested in understanding this. We can accept that geography may be limiting patients from rural areas to enroll. Health literacy can be an issue, both around English as a first language, education and socioeconomic status can play into these things in terms of really being able to understand the truth of participating in a clinical trial or not. Older patients, again, tend to be underrepresented as well, and this remains a concern as cancer tends to be a disease frequently of elderly patients in most circumstances. Ultimately, when trying to put all this together, patients need to be interested in a study. They need to be eligible to enroll into it. Trials come in different shapes and sizes and may present their own unique complexity. But in the background, many of us do often think that clinical trials can provide patients interesting opportunities to be able to access novel therapies. Now, how to think about this when engaging patients in a shared decision-making model about participating in clinical trials. And I think here, this is really the gold standard about how we want to be able to engage with patients. And as we think about this, again, another self-reflection question here, what are some best practices when discussing clinical trial participation with a patient? And it can be very difficult when thinking about how and when to do this, because many of the clinical trials that we run in hematology and in oncology are in later stage disease. You're often forced to have a difficult conversation about relapse or disease progression, perhaps shifting away from a curative to a non-curative setting. You're discussing palliation. You're discussing the failure of treatment that you might have been involved in giving. And it's sometimes a very difficult conversation to be able to pivot to participating in a research study. But at the same time, it may also offer some degree of hope when thinking about other alternatives, depending on the circumstance. So when preparing for that conversation, I think these are many of the issues that we like to be aware of when getting into the conversation. Clinical trials may be perceived to have some costs. It's important to recognize that usually in the conduct of clinical trials, the majority of these things are going to be covered by the study or covered through standard of care interventions. However, that being said, there is the potential for out-of-pocket expenses for patients. In some reports, this could be up to $1,000 per month. Often, there could be financial supports that are available, stipends for travel or reimbursement. There may be, again, through a cancer center or through advocacy groups, the opportunity to access some additional funds. But again, costs do remain a big barrier. It is important to be transparent about this up front, because certainly the goal is to enroll patients that are going to participate through the trial for retention so that you can better understand outcomes, be able to monitor them for both acute and delayed toxicities. And so, again, being willing to have that conversation early with the trials team, I think, is highly relevant. Yeah, so when thinking a little bit more about that conversation, the placebo arm, or again, whatever the standard control arm might be in a study, if it is randomized, it's really important to highlight this for the patient so that they understand that they may not be receiving experimental therapy, receiving a placebo and what that may mean in relationship to a standard of care arm. But it's important to highlight that in a setting where you're comparing an experimental treatment to a standard, randomization is highly important, because this is how we can understand the impact of that novel therapy in a non-biased and valid way. Importantly, I think we can all recognize that patients randomized to either side of a treatment in a clinical trial will be key to understanding the effectiveness of this treatment and to the success of the clinical trial. But, patients may be hoping that they receive that experimental arm because of the perception that they believe it will be better. And so it's important to manage that expectation and to offer some support, but also to recognize that patients need to be comfortable with randomization when thinking about this type of study. It's also important to think about other expectations in terms of what to expect when going on to a clinical trial. So I do feel it's important for patients to recognize that clinical trials are not really designed to look after patients. They're designed to test a hypothesis and to evaluate a specific outcome. And as we highlighted earlier, based on the phase of trial, that might be response, it could be safety, it could be some sort of disease control endpoint. And a specific outcome for an individual patient is not the goal of the clinical trial. And it is certainly possible, if a trial is not successful, there may not be benefit for the whole group of patients, let alone for a specific patient. But knowledge gain is really the ultimate goal from a clinical trial in terms of being able to take that information, then apply it moving forward. It is important when discussing a clinical trial with a patient to go through the differences in terms of where a study may be in development. Is it early phase? Is it phase 2? Is it a phase 3 study? Is it really ultimately seeing if a new therapy may be better than the standard of care? And important to highlight that there is some variation, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation. So even a phase 1 study can run the gamut from a first in human, completely unknown, to evaluating two very effective drugs in combination. So where you might expect effectiveness to be very high, but safety may be unknown, or safety might be well described in a different patient population. And so the level of risk may be very different when thinking about the specifics of an early phase clinical trial. Thinking about a phase 2 study, if you're already adding to an established standard, it's unlikely the treatment's going to be worse from an effectiveness standpoint, but you may be thinking a little bit more about toxicity. And that goal, by the time something gets to a phase 3, it should have a track record enough behind it that you should feel confident with the experimental arm, because there's equipoise about knowing if it's better than the standard of care, and the standard of care is the standard. And so that would be a reasonable expectation for a patient to receive. And again, thinking about all of this, always trying to think from the patient's perspective and understanding that and be able to anticipate it and offer support during this discussion is really key to success. It's also important to recognize that participation in a trial is important from a time commitment standpoint. And so patients need to realize that this may require more commitment from them to be available to the trial center, to be able to go through more tests and screening, the potential for more regular monitoring, and so more clinic visits, more imaging tests, potentially more follow-up. The treatment phase, the duration may be different than what you see in the standard of care setting. There may be longer term follow-up, which may be a little different than what the cancer center may practice. And so when thinking about all of these things, it's an important time commitment. And if people are coming from a distance, it's important to recognize and important to highlight that there may not be that much flexibility when thinking about how scheduling may go. Lastly, if it does require patients to take time off work to come to the center if they're unwell and going through treatment, this can also create an additional barrier to participation and challenge for patients. And certainly logistics around travel can be another issue. Do you need a family member or friend to be able to bring you back and forth, depending on how you're feeling? And so there are multiple issues at play when thinking about participating in a clinical trial. Thinking about informed consent, it's also important to highlight that this is an important document in the conduct of a clinical trial. It is approved by your ethics board, but helps you because it explains the purpose of the trial in easy to understand English. It helps to explain potential risks and the potential benefits of participating, how personal health information could be used, really emphasizing that participation is voluntary, that a patient may drop out or refuse treatments or procedures during the study. It'll let patients know when medical information can be accessed, when they may be able to see study results. So it's good for a member of the trials team to go through the consent form with the patient to ensure that they understand language or any legal jargon that can be used. And again, this is an open conversation where it's good to encourage questions and get feedback. So again, patients feel empowered and knowledgeable about what they're thinking as they go through the clinical trial informed consent process. How to manage and support patients enrolled during a clinical trial. So certainly there's all of the routine follow-up that's happening in the clinic and the testing and those sorts of things. There'll be plenty of opportunities to check in and assess how the patient is coping. Again, maybe additional members of the trials team outside of the investigator will be involved in some of these things. There are opportunities to suggest additional support services that can be available. And again, always be open to addressing new concerns or be aware of unusual or uncommon toxicities or again, some of the challenges that may come up during trial participation around frequency of visits, et cetera, as they arise. So now that we have an opportunity again to have a little bit of self-reflection on this topic of participation in clinical trials for patients, one of the things that really stands out when looking at this topic in a little more detail is the very challenge of being able to have this conversation with a patient. Again, often a very difficult time in their journey of going through cancer treatment, and important to recognize that much like talking about diagnosis for the first time, patients may not be prepared to absorb all of that information at any one time. And so, again, from a best practice standpoint, it's often very useful to bring up the concept of the clinical trial, be able to follow up with it at a subsequent visit, or even if you think that you've perhaps been successful in having that conversation, perhaps another member of the clinical trial team would have an opportunity to discuss it further with the patient at a separate visit when they have a little more time or have had some time to be able to reflect on what they heard before, or potentially understand what's happening. The good thing about this when thinking about working with patients in the clinical research setting is you often have a longitudinal relationship, and there is often the time to come back to this question. And if a patient may not be entirely ready to hear about a clinical trial at the time they've just heard about disease progression, it's something that can be discussed again, if you've done some further tests to further restage the disease, or if you're needing to organize some other studies to help manage them moving forward. And, from a treatment and patient perspective, being able to incorporate all of that at different times is going to be the key, because you'll have to really work with when the patient is going to be ready to hear this type of information with regards to looking at clinical trials. And now maybe we'll just close with a couple of key clinical pearls when thinking about clinical trials in our field. Clinical trials have been and remain crucial for the advancement of patient outcome in all disease areas, particularly in hematologic malignancies. There are certainly many benefits to the participation in clinical trials, although there are some risks, as I think we've already highlighted throughout the presentation. It's important for clinicians to be able to prepare to discuss potential costs of participation, the possibility of receiving a placebo, the time commitment involved in participation. All of these things are really important when having discussions about trial participation with patients. It's important to really spend time on informed consent with patients to really ensure they understand what they're getting into, and that they are fully aware when providing informed consent. It's important to regularly check in with patients so that they continue to be clear about the importance of participating, and that they remain engaged with keeping up with study procedures, and they also can raise their own concerns about participating as they come up. Clinical research is very much a team sport, and so it can be a very rewarding endeavor for a group to work on a big clinical trial where it looks like you're providing benefit to patients, and again provides a great avenue to continue to work quite closely with patients who may be, again, in a very challenging time in their cancer journey, as an example. And so with that, I'd like to close, and again, thank you very much for your attention on this very important topic.